Good morning, good morning. Happy Thursday. It is July 9th, 2020. And I want to welcome you to this week's episode of When Life Needs a Detox. My name is Carol White, and I am your life detox strategist. I want to thank you guys so much for showing up. I do appreciate all of the comments and suggestions that you leave. I'm glad that there are so many of you that find the references helpful and interesting. I will continue to share. There are, some people that don't like what I have to say, um, or they don't agree with my point of view, and that's perfectly okay. You're not supposed to agree with everything that comes your way. If you have a point of view, you should express it. As long as at the end of the day, everybody has been respectful of everybody else. Okay? Now, I'm going to get started quite quickly because I got issues going on with my AC, and this area where my computer is doesn't get a lot of air circulation, so it's getting very hot. So if you see me doing this, you know why. Today's topic is going to be the Reconstruction and the KKK. We've been talking about racism in history, and there's no way we can talk about uh, the Civil War and the Reconstruction of the South without bringing up the KKK. It simply is what it is. Now, the KKK actually got started in 1865 by, see, I usually keep my stuff right here, and I didn't today. I'm so sorry. But it was 6 Confederate veterans from Pulaski, Tennessee that got together and formed the original Ku Klux Klan during the Reconstruction of the South. Now, there was supposed to be this secret, oath-bound society that used violence as a means to control and intimidate Blacks and political leaders. They don't really talk too much about the political leaders, but they always show how they went after Blacks, how they used violence to control and intimidate freed Blacks in the South. But also, what you have to understand is the South was Democratic at the time. So the KKK was founded by Democrats. And I know that because there was a Mr. Carter that told me, well, you everybody keeps blaming the Republicans. It was the Democrats that started the KKK. And he's absolutely right, because the entire South was Democratic. So yes, the KKK has its basic origin in the Democratic Party. But we must keep in mind that the federal government was Republican. And during the Reconstruction, both the South and the North realized that there was no way for the South to get back to its former glory without its former workforce. We talked about this last week. The South was built on slave labor. So if you're going to reconstruct, you have to have all elements in place. So you need that workforce back. But the workforce had been freed by Abraham Lincoln, who was assassinated. Now Andrew Jackson, a Republican, is in place. How did they get around being responsible for this? Andrew Jackson said, you know what? We can't tell these freed people that they now have to go back to being slaves. What we'll do is let them enjoy the perception of being free. But we will leave it to each individual state as to how they handle their labor issues. Okay? You do what you have to do to get your labor force. That's when you got the black codes and the pig laws. We talked about this last week too. So now you have to have all of this enforced. Enter the KKK. As blacks were migrating away from the South, they had bands of KKK per state that would use violence and intimidation tactics to get them to come back. If they wanted to vote, they used violence and intimidation to quell the need to vote. And this worked. Let's face it, it worked. Because you then had, after the black codes and pig laws, you had Jim Crow. And all of this was under the intimidation tactics of the KKK. But there's something we need to understand about the KKK. The KKK, in its inception, tried to be organized. They tried to get an organizational chart together as to who did what and why. Here's the problem. They couldn't get each faction to agree on what should and should not be done. Everybody wanted to do everything their own way. So you have Alabama's KKK, who's different from Louisiana KKK, who's different from Tennessee KKK, who's different from Mississippi KKK. You get the idea. You understand. But you have to look at, when you start talking about that, you have to ask, why couldn't they get this together? Well, you have to understand the makeup of the KKK. Yes, you had retired veterans that formed the KKK. But here's what you had for membership. And I got this from Wikipedia. And I quote, lifting the Klan mask revealed a chaotic multitude of anti-black vigilante groups that covered us, disgruntled poor white farmers, wartime guerrilla bands, displaced Democratic politicians, illegal whiskey distillers, coercive moral reformers, sadists, rapists, white workmen fearful of black competition, employers trying to enforce labor discipline, common thieves, neighbors with decades-old grudges, and even a few freedmen and white Republicans who allied with Democratic whites or had criminal agendas of their own. Indeed, all they had in common, besides being overwhelmingly white, Southern, and Democratic, was what they called themselves, or were called, Klansmen. You're trying to get a bunch of folks that are anti-establishment to begin with to adhere to established rules. They don't. Criminals don't do that. Zealots don't do that. People who are trying to get back at somebody else don't play by the rules. So they could never, ever get themselves together to be organized. And all I can say, quite frankly, is thank God. Now, the Klan was running amok. They ran amok. I'm sorry, I have to get my paper back. I threw it too far. But here's the thing. Nobody really went after the Klan for what they were doing. They were murdering blacks, but not just blacks. They were going after Republican politicians, which means they went after white folks too. They didn't just stop at blacks. They went after whoever made them mad. It got so bad that they actually had to come up with what they call enforcement codes. Oh my goodness, here we go. The Enforcement Acts, rather. And these occurred in 1870 and 1871. Now, the main goal in creating these acts were to improve conditions for blacks and free slaves. The main target of these acts was the Ku Klux Klan, who made it a point of targeting blacks and then, as we will see much later, other groups. Now, while it was meant to fight the KKK and to help blacks and freedmen, there were many states that were reluctant to take such an extreme action for several reasons. The politicians on the state and federal level were either members of the Klan or they didn't have enough strength to fight the Klan. Isn't that something? You actually put up a law to fight the Klan, and the people that are supposed to enforce the law are the Klan. Really? Now, they had the Enforcement Act of 1870, which prohibited discrimination by state officials in voter registration on the basis of race, color, or previous condition or servitude. It also authorized the president to employ the use of the army to uphold this regulation. This act banned the use of terror, force, or bribery to prevent people from voting because of their race. That's a good thing. And then you had the Enforcement Act of 1871, and it permitted federal oversight of local and local and state elections if any two citizens in the town with more than 20,000 inhabitants desired to have it. Now, it was pretty similar to the Enforcement Act of 1870, but it revised it with the intention of being more effective. The Enforcement Act of 1871 had more severe punishments and larger fines. Now, they did lower the fines after a while because they have to, people complain. The prison sentences that they gave for violating this act did remain the same. And it was best enforced by the government. Now, the Ku Klux Klan Act. Oh my gosh, it made state officials liable in federal court for depriving anyone of their civil rights or equal protection under the law. It also made a number of the KKK's intimidation tactics into federal offenses. And all of this was not because of what they did to blacks, but because they started going after political officials. I know this isn't perfect, but I'm working on my perfection. But these laws were great. And I have to say this. These laws were great. The Enforcement Acts, the Ku Klux Klan Act, during 1870, 1871, they were great. They also, during this time, deemed the Ku Klux Klan as a terrorist organization. Now, because the offenses were now federal and federally enforced, the Klan began to disband. You had little groups, even the little statewide groups, they disbanded, and you had a little pocket here, a little pocket there. But the one thing I noticed, and maybe somebody can help me out here. This earring is so crazy. Anyway, what I happen to notice is that during all of this Reconstruction, nobody ever heard from the abolitionists again. Isn't that interesting? We know that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans cared about keeping freed blacks free. But what happened to the abolitionists that started this, that said they need to be free? And the one thing that comes to mind when it comes to the KKK and political parties, nobody really cares about the blacks in this country. They didn't care then, and they don't care now. They have to be made to care. I'm sorry, I digressed. I have to get back to what I was talking about. Now, like I said, with these federal laws in place, you saw a disbanding of the KKK. Well, you turn around in 1882, and a federal judge says, we really can't prosecute these cases on a federal level because they all happen state by state by state. All of these cases are getting kicked back to the state level. Well, now you have judges that belong to the KKK prosecuting offenders who are KKK. There was no justice. None. They're not going to put their own in jail. But you still had a disbandment and a lull in the KKK until 1915, when the movie A Birth of a Nation came out, which glorified the actions of the KKK. And what did it show? It showed a black man chasing a white woman through the forest. To keep this man from touching her, she jumps to her death. The Klan goes and finds the black man and hangs him. And they are seen as protecting the virtue and the chastity of a white woman. This started the resurgence of the Klan. But the Klan expanded who they went after. They not only went after blacks, they went after the Catholics, the Jews, Russians, Italians, and anyone that was European that came over to this country. It also expanded from the South leading into the Midwest. You had branches that were so strong in Indiana and still are strong in Indiana. But they dissipated as well. Because once you had, they dissipated. Once you got into federal charging, the Klan dissipated. And once again, they went into hiding, and they didn't resurge for the third time, only in the South during the 1950s and the 1960s, when you started dealing with the Civil Rights Act. And I'm going to end this right here today. And we're going to talk some more about the Klan and how, yeah, I'm getting hot. I have to get out of here. We're going to talk some more next week about the Klan and their role in the Civil Rights Act, because they did play an amazing role. And we cannot talk about civil rights or the history of racism until we start talking about the Klan. And we have to understand what we're dealing with if we're going to fight. If we're going to fight successfully, we have to understand who our enemy is and why our enemy is. Yes, I'm hot, and we're going to end this. This has been this week's episode of When Life Needs a Detox. My name is Carol Ann White. I am so glad you joined me today. I love you all to the moon and back. And I will see you next week. Bye-bye. Take care.